Tonight we will continue our reading of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan. We last left off at chapter 8. Why are we reading Weird Scenes in the Canyon, Inside the Canyon? We are reading Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon as a part of our Songwriter Secret Studies, where we have gone over the songs. We've looked at some of the deeper things behind the mind control programming and the Luciferian system that we call the music industry and what happens in it. And we also look at things outside of what the average person would to glean more information from. For instance, we once read Marvin Jan, the book about Marvin Gaye and his second wife Janice, and we drew a lot of clues and a great deal more understanding about the songwriter's secret on its deeper levels, how it affects people, what gets them there, the way that they struggle with it, as Marvin Gaye did. And we will also follow up Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon with Divided Soul, David Ritt's autobiography, or David Ritt's biography written with Marvin Gaye. David Ritz is the co-writer of Sexual Healing, and there's a long story behind that, and we'll find that as we read the book. All of these things have spiritual implications, of course. We look at things from that perspective on down. So without any further ado, let's go into chapter 8. Again, the book is called, in case you're reading along, or you want to read along, or you're interested, you should. I highly recommend that you get a couple of David's books. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, it's the one we're reading now. And I also have Programmed to Kill. And both are excellent reads, especially for understanding mind control and the way that it's used in our system. So let's get to the book. Chapter 8. As all halfway decent managers in the rock era have done, Jim Dixon worked on seducing the in crowd and creating a buzz around the birds. The timing was perfect. LA's baby boomers were mobile, getting around, looking for action. And now they were joined by the hip elite of Hollywood itself, from Sal Mineo and Peter Fonda to junkie comic Lenny Bruce. End quote. From Barney Hoyskins, writing in Waiting for the Sun. Okay. As important as the Freaks were to building an audience for the new Laurel Canyon bands, there was another group that played a key role as well, Hollywood's so-called Young Turks. Like the Freaks, the Turks became an immediate and constant presence on the newly emerging Sunset Strip scene. And as with the Freaks, their presence on the Strip was heavily promoted by the media. Locals and tourists alike knew where to go to gawk at the Freaks and, as an added bonus, quite possibly rub shoulders with the likes of Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, and Warren Beatty, along with their female counterparts such as Jane Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, and Sharon Tate. And to all regular listeners and viewers of this program, we will follow this reading tonight with prayer and praise live stream as well. Next paragraph. And as with the freaks, the Turks were also instrumental in distracting attention away from the less than stellar musicianship on the stage. After all, young men offered the chance to see Jane Mansfield in the flesh probably didn't even notice whether there was a band on stage at all. Mansfield, by the way, like Mansonites, Susan Atkins, and Bobby Beausoleil, had direct ties to Anton LaVey and his Church of Satan. And didn't we relate in the last broadcast that Jane Mansfield is Mariska Hargitay's mom? And Mariska Hargitay is seen on American televisions almost every day. As Liv from SUV. Jane Mansfield has pictures with Manson that I'm sure a lot of you good truthers and researchers have seen by now. Not Manson, with LaVey. Jane Mansfield, Anton LaVey. Famous pictures. And it's interesting that the circle, the degrees of separation that you find amongst these Laurel Canyon characters. But yes, this is him and her. And of course, it was promoted as publicity. But those close to the situation say that she was an actual member, a true member of the Satanic Church. Okay. Many of these young and glamorous Hollywood stars forged very close bonds with the Laurel Canyon musicians. Some of them, including Peter Fonda, found homes in the canyon so that they could live, work, and party among the rock stars, and in their free time pass around John Phillips' wife Michelle to just about every swinging in the canyon, including Jack Nicholson, Dennis Hopper, Warren Beatty, Roman Polanski, and Gene Clark of the Byrds. Some of them never left. Jack Nicholson to this day lives in a spacious estate just off the portion of Mulholland Drive that lies between Laurel Canyon and Coldwater Canyon, not far west of Nicholson's property, which now includes the neighboring estate formerly owned by Marlon Brando, who will come up in the Quincy Jones, Marvin Gaye conversation when we get there in our next reading. Not far west of Nicholson's property, which now includes the neighboring estate formerly owned by Marlon Brando. Okay. We got disconnected, so I just wanted to wait until we got back. Okay. Here we go. From the symbiotic relationship between Laurel Canyon actors and Laurel Canyon musicians arose a series of feature films that are now considered countercultural classics. When you take a film class at the university today, they will show you a Kenneth Anger film, for instance. That's my sidebar. Okay. One such film was The Trip, 1967, an unintentionally hilarious attempt to create a cinematic facsimile of an LSD trip. Written by, of all people, Jack Nicholson. The movie starred fellow Turks Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, and Bruce Dern. Seated in the director's chair was Roger Corman, who throughout his career worked side by side with David Crosby's dad on no less than 23 feature films. Recruited to supply the soundtrack for the film was Graham Parsons' International Submarine Band. Parsons' music, however, was ultimately not used, though the band does make a brief on-screen appearance. The house where most of the film was shot, at the top of Kirkwood Drive in Laurel Canyon, became the home of Love's Arthur Lee. Another psychedelic cult film of the late 1960s with deep roots in Laurel Canyon was the Monkees' 1968 big screen offering, Head. Also scripted by Nicholson, with assistance from Bob Rafelson, the movie included cameo appearances by Canyon Dwellers Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, and the press, Frank Zappa. The music, performed of course by the Monkees, was a mix of songs written by the band and contributions from Canyon songwriters like Carole King. Oh, I didn't know she was from the Canyon. Big songwriter. Big time. From Canyon songwriters like Carole King and Harry Nilsson. Shockingly, some of that music is actually pretty good. Even more shockingly, the movie overall is arguably the most watchable of the 1960s cult films. It is certainly a vast improvement over, for example, 1968's wretched Psych Out, starring Nicholson and Dern. I didn't realize that Jack Nicholson had so much to do with this propaganda from this era. I do realize, by the way, that some of you out there in Readerland cringe every time that I mention the Monkees as though they were a quote-unquote real band. No more than Pinocchio was a real boy, my friend. The reality, though, is that they were every bit as real as most of their contemporaries. And while the made-for-TV Beatles replicants were looked down upon by music critics and fans alike, they were fully accepted as members of the musical fraternity by the other Laurel Canyon bands. The homes of both Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork were popular Canyon hangouts in the late 60s for a number of real musicians. Also, regularly dropping by Dolen's party house were Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson. Now, the difference in perception between their peers and the public was attributable to the fact that the other bands knew something that the fans did not. The very same studio musicians who appeared without credit on the Monkees albums also appeared without credit on their albums. And then, of course, there was the fact that so many of Laurel Canyon's real musicians had taken a stab at being a part of the Monkees, including Stephen Stills, Love's Brian McLean, and Three Dog Night's Danny Hutton, all of whom answered the Monkees' casting call and were rejected. I mean, what serious musician or musician looking to be taken seriously at the time would want to be affiliated with or call himself a Monkee as a band? But as a kid, not knowing any better and not knowing anything about authentic musicianship in that genre, I saw the Monkees and I liked them. I watched them. They came on during cartoon time, so they were being introduced to generations and demographics that were really out of their reach, or outside the range of their target audience. But let's read on. Hey, we're the Monkees. There were undoubtedly other future stars who auditioned for the show as well, though most would probably prefer not to discuss such things. Despite persistent rumors, however, there was one local musician who can safely conclude, whom we can safely conclude did not read for a part. And that local musician's name was Charles Manson. Given that the show was cast in 1965, The Monkees Show, and began its brief television run in 1966, while Charlie was still imprisoned at Terminal Island, awaiting his release in March of 1967, there doesn't appear to be any way that Manson could have been considered for a part on the show. And that's kind of a shame when you think about it. Because if he had been, we might today remember Charlie Manson not as one of America's most notorious criminals, but rather as the guy who made Marsha Brady swoon. Wow. Marsha. Returning to the counterculture films of the 1960s, the most critically acclaimed of the lot, and the one with the deepest roots in Laurel Canyon was, you already know, right? Dennis Hopper's Piece de Resistance. Easy Rider. Easy Rider is a classic film to that generation and to hippiedom at large. Easy Rider, 1969 film. Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Phil Spector. Really? Phil Spector played a role. Okay. There's Easy Rider, for those who are not familiar. Okay. Let's see what else it says here. Directed by Dennis Hopper. Directed by Dennis Hopper from a script co-written by he and Peter Fonda, the film starred Fonda and Hopper, along with Jack Nicholson. Hopper's walrus-mustached character in the film was based on David Crosby. One more time. Hopper's walrus-mustachioed character in the film was based on David Crosby, who was regularly seen racing his motorcycle up and down the winding streets of Laurel Canyon. That motorcycle, by the way, had been a gift from Crosby's good buddy, Peter Fonda. Fonda's absurd Captain America character was inspired either by John Phillips' writing partner, Graham Parsons, or by Crosby's former bandmate in the Byrds, Roger McGuinn, depending on who's telling the story. That very same Roger McGuinn scored the original music for the film. His contributions were joined on the soundtrack by offerings from fellow Canyonite musicians Steppenwolf, the Byrds, Fraternity of Man, and Jimi Hendrix. And the movie's hippie commune was reportedly created and filmed in the canyons near Mulholland Drive. Since Easy Rider had such deep roots in the Laurel Canyon scene, we need to briefly focus our attention here on one other individual who worked on the film, art director Jeremy Kay, aka Jerry Kay. Before Easy Rider, Kay had worked on such cinematic abominations as Angels from Hell, Hell's Angels on Wheels. Oh, he's very creative with the titles. Diverse. With Jack Nicholson, and Scorpio Rising, Kenneth Anger's occult-tinged homage to gay biker culture. Didn't know that was a thing, but I suppose that's where the Village People got that one gay biker character from. You go back and look at the Village People. Interesting. Jeremy Kay. Let's take a look at Jeremy Kay real quick. A lot of times we give a lot of the blame, if you will, to the people in the front. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. The one that you notice is the one you pay attention to. But oftentimes it's folks behind the scenes, the art directors, the set designers, stylists, they have a huge part to play in creating the image and illusion that the Luciferians want a particular artist to have. So Jeremy Kay, art director, he's not well known enough, I suppose. So real quick. Typing with my left hand. Forgive me. Jeremy Kay. Oh, okay, this must be him. Or someone named after him. So yeah, he doesn't seem to have an internet imprint, and that's okay. A lot of people don't. But I was just curious because with that type of resume, I'm certain he was a interesting looking character, to say the least. In the mid 1970s, Jeremy Kay would write, direct, and produce a charming little film entitled Satan's Children. This guy has got to be on the internet. I just can't believe this. Hold on. Satan's Children director. Because okay, there we go. 1975 adventure horror. Directed by Jeremy Kay with Maria DeFalco. It still doesn't say much about him at all. I guess this was the trailer, the poster, the promo poster. People say, can you make it big? You used to could make it big. I don't know how to do it now. What's this? That's not how you do it. Yeah, you used to could just click on it and make it bigger, but it doesn't work that way now. It takes you to the site, and I don't want to do that. Okay, just curious. Okay. Of far more interest here than his film credits, though, is his membership in the 1960s in a group known as the Solar Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, Crowley's group, which found itself on the news, and not in a good way, just after Easy Rider opened on theater screens across America. 2 weeks after Easy Rider premiered on July 14th, 1969, police acting on a phone tip raided the Solar Lodge's compound near Blythe, California, and found a 6-year-old boy locked outdoors in a 6x6 wooden crate in the sweltering desert heat. The young boy, whose father was a Los Angeles County probation officer, had been chained to a steel plate for nearly 2 months in temperatures reaching as high as 117 degrees Fahrenheit. According to an FBI report, the box also contained a can partially filled with human waste and swarming with flies. The stench was nauseating. Before being put in the box, the child had been burned with matches and beaten with bamboo poles by cult members. The leader of the cult, Georgina Brayton had reportedly told cult members that when it was convenient, she was going to give the boy LSD and set fire to the structure in which he was chained and give him just enough chain to get out of reach of the fire. Killing had also been discussed and apparently condoned by the boy's mind-screwed mother. So she was involved in the cult as well, the mother of the child. Lord. And see, oftentimes you'll find government agencies attached to these children who undergo these traumas because they pick from among their own. And sometimes they are offered the children from among their own. 11 adult members of the sect were charged with felony child abuse, the majority of them young white men in their early 20s. All were brought to trial and convicted. In a curious bit of timing, the raid that resulted in the arrests and convictions coincided with the torture and murder of musician Gary Hinman by a trio of Manson acolytes. Although it is not surprisingly vehemently denied by concerned parties, various sources have claimed that Manson had ties to the group, which also maintained a home near the USC campus in Los Angeles. There is no doubt that Charlie preached the same dogma, including the notion of an apocalyptic race war looming on the horizon. That was his helter-skelter idea. They don't mention that often. They used to never mention it when they talk of Manson. They do mention it now today. But that was his whole thing. He thought that he could get the end of the world started by kicking off race war. And that concept was embodied by the term helter-skelter. Okay. The massacre at the Tate residence occurred less than 2 weeks after the raid on the OTO compound. Manson's Barker Ranch hideout would be raided a few months later, on October 12, 1969, the birthday, as I may have already mentioned, of Aleister Crowley, the Grand Poobah of the OTO, until his death in 1947. Anyway, sorry about that little digression, folks. I'm not entirely sure how we ended up at the Barker Ranch when the focus of this chapter was supposed to be on the Young Turks. So having now established that those Turks were a fully integrated part of the Laurel Canyon / Sunset Strip scene, and also that they played an important role in luring the public out to the new clubs to check out the new bands, because you might see Fonda, you might see Nicholson. Our next task is to get to know a little bit about who these folks were and where they came from. Let's begin with Mr. Bruce Dern, who has some of the most provocative connections of any of the characters in this story. Bruce Dern. For those who visually learn, bring up his picture for all concerned. Bruce. That's him old. This is him young. Gur. Okay. Famous for shooting John Wayne in the back in the movie The Cowboys. I guess among other things. Okay. It's probably safe to say that Dern's parents had rather impressive political connections, given that baby Bruce's godparents were sitting First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and future two-time Democratic presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson, he lost both times in 1952 and 1956 to Eisenhower. Excuse me. Bruce's paternal grandfather was a guy by the name of George Dern, who served as Secretary of War under President Franklin Roosevelt. For the youngsters in the crowd, Secretary of War is what we used to call the Secretary of Defense in a slightly less Orwellian era. George Dern had also served as governor of Utah and chairman of the National Governors Association. Bruce's mother was born Jean McLeish, and she happened to be the sister of Archibald McLeish, who also served under Franklin Roosevelt as the director of the War Department's Office of Facts and Figures, and as the assistant director of the Office of War Information. In other words, Archibald McLeish was essentially America's Minister of War Propaganda. He also served at various times as an Assistant Secretary of State and as the Librarian of Congress. Perhaps the most impressive item on his resume, however, was his membership in everyone's favorite secret society, Skull and Bones, class of 1915, 1 year before Prescott Bush was tapped in 1916. It would appear then that even by Laurel Canyon standards, Mr. Dern has friends in very high places. Let's turn our attention now to the guy who shared the screen with Dern in The Trip, Mr. Peter Fonda. Of course, we all know that Fonda is the son of good old Hank Fonda, lovable Hollywood liberal and all-around nice guy. And to the youngsters listening, the Fondas were a powerful family like the Breyers or the Sheens, connected and well known. And anyway, and certainly even a contrarian such as myself would not be so bold as to suggest that Henry Fonda might have some skeletons in his closet, right? Just for the hell of it, though, there are a few chapters of there are a few chapters of the Hank Fonda saga that we should probably review here. We can begin, I suppose, by noting that Hank served as a decorated U.S. Naval Intelligence officer during World War II, thus sparing Peter the stigma of being the only member of the Laurel Canyon in crowd to have not been spawned by a member of the military intelligence community. Not too many years after the war, Hank's wife, Frances Ford Seymour, who claimed to be a direct descendant of Jane Seymour, third wife of King Henry VIII, was found with her throat slashed open with a straight razor. Peter was just 10 years old at the time of his mother's alleged suicide on April 14, 1950. When Seymour had met and married Hank Fonda, she was the widow of George Brokaw, who had curiously enough previously been married to prominent CIA operative Claire Booth Luce. Fonda rebounded quickly from Seymour's unusual death, and within 8 months he was married once again. 8 months after the suicide of your wife, you're married again. To Susan Blanchard, to whom he remained married until 1956. In 1957, Hank married yet again, this time to Italian Countess Afdera Franchetti, who followed up her 4-year marriage to Fonda with a rumored affair with newly sworn-in President John Kennedy. Franchetti, as it turns out, is the daughter of Baron Raimondo Franchetti, who was a consultant to fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. The Countess is also the great-granddaughter of Louise Sarah Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family. Perhaps you've heard of them. Before moving on, I should probably mention that Hank's first wife, Margaret Sullivan, who was yet another child of Norfolk, Virginia, also allegedly committed suicide on New Year's Day, 1960. 9 months later, her daughter Bridget followed suit. In 1961, very soon after the deaths of first her mother and then her sister, Sullivan's other daughter, Brooke Hayward, walked down the aisle with the next young Turk on our list, Dennis Hopper. For those who may be unfamiliar with Hopper's body of work, he's the guy who was once found wandering naked and bewildered in a Mexican forest. And the guy who, after divorcing Hayward in 1969, married Michelle Phillips on Halloween Day, 1970, only to have her file for divorce just 8 days later, claiming that Dennis Hopper had kept her handcuffed and imprisoned her for a week while making, quote, unnatural sexual demands, unquote. Without passing judgment here, I think it's fair to say that Michelle Phillips has been around the block a time or two, if you catch my drift. So if even she thought Hopper's demands were a bit over the top, then one can only wonder just how unnatural they might have been. For what it's worth, Hopper once told a journalist that he didn't handcuff her, he just punched her out. In his mind, apparently, that made him somewhat less of a troglodyte. Most official biographies of Hopper would lead one to believe that he was the son of a simple farmer. Dennis recently acknowledged, however, that that was clearly not the case. Quote, "My mother's father was a wheat farmer, and I was raised on their farm. But my father was not a farmer." To the contrary, Hopper's dad was a working person in intelligence, quote unquote, who during World War II, quote, was in the OSS. He was in China, Burma, India. Dennis Hopper has proudly proclaimed that his father was one of the 100 guys that liberated General Wainwright out of prison in Korea, which might be a little more impressive were it not for the fact that it was actually the Red Army that freed Wainwright and other prisoners. The U.S. intel team just came to pick them up, debrief them, and transport them home, but that, I suppose, isn't really relevant. After the war, according to Hopper, his dad routinely carried a gun, which I suppose is what most lay ministers in the Methodist Church do. The family also left the farm in Kansas and relocated to San Diego, California, home of the Imperial Beach Naval Air Station, the United States Naval Radio Station, the United States Naval Amphibious Base, the North Island Naval Air Station, Fort Rosecrans Military Reservation, the United States Naval Training Center, the United States Marine Corps Recruit Depot, and the Miramar Marine Corps Air Station. And just north of the city sits the massive Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base. Other than that, though, San Diego is just a sleepy little beach town where Hopper's dad ostensibly worked for the post office. Wink. The more recent incarnation of Dennis Hopper, by the way, was wildly at odds with the hippie image that he had at one time tried very hard to cultivate. Before his death on May 29, 2010, Hopper was an unapologetic cheerleader for right-wing causes, who proudly boasted of having voted a straight Republican ticket for over 30 years. A straight Republican ticket for over 30 years, but yet the image and the propaganda behind hippies is anathema to what Republicans and conservatives stand for. Again, further showing that he was playing a role, and likely one that he was designed to play. To briefly recap then, we have thus far met 3 of the young Turks, and we have found that one of them is the nephew of a bonesman. Another is the son of a naval intelligence officer who was once married to a Rothschild descendant. And the third was the slightly deranged son of an OSS CIA / officer. Come to think of it, we've actually covered one of the Turkettes as well, since Jane Fonda obviously came from the same background as her younger brother Peter. As for the other female members of the posse, Sharon Tate was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate, a career U.S. Army intelligence officer. Wow. And Nancy Sinatra is, of course, the daughter of Francis Albert Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, whose known associates included Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Sam Giancana, Carlo Gambino, Gaetano Lucchese, and Joseph Fischetti, a cousin of Al Capone. Frank Sinatra was also a client of hairdresser to the stars Jay Sebring, one of those murdered during the Tate murders. Interesting. As was Henry Fonda, also, who at one time, strangely enough, lived in the guest house at 10050 CeeLo Drive. Wow. Once lived there. Yet another client of Sebring's was the next young Turk on our list, Warren Beatty, whose father, Ira Owens Beatty, was ostensibly a professor of psychology. Young Warren, however, spent all of his early years living in various spooky suburbs of Washington, D.C. He was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1937, after which his father moved the family to Norfolk, Virginia, which I think I may have mentioned is home to the world's largest naval facility. The reason for that, by the way, is that Norfolk is the gateway to the nation's capital. The family later relocated to Arlington, Virginia, home of the Pentagon, where Warren attended high school where he was known on the football field as, according to John Phillips, who attended a rival school, he was known as Mad Dog Beatty on the field. Ira Beatty's relatively frequent relocations, and the fact that those relocations always seemed to land the family in D.C. suburbs that are of considerable significance to the military intelligence community, would tend to indicate that Warren's dad was something other than what he appeared to be, though that is, of course, a speculative assessment. But if Ira Beatty was on the payroll of some government entity working within the psychology departments of various D.C. area universities, then it wouldn't require a huge leap of faith to further speculate about what type of work he was doing, given the wholesale co-opting of the field of psychology by the MK Ultra program and affiliated projects. The next young Turk up for review is the one who went on to become arguably the most acclaimed actor of his generation, Mr. Jack Nicholson. You all know Jack. Everybody knows Jack Nicholson. Shining, the Lakers games. One of the most heralded actors of our time. Also invented a car that ran on water, right? Didn't he? Or he was backing that. At one time, he's a character, people say. Oh, yes, me. Remember me as the Joker? Wait till they get a load of me. He killed it in The Shining. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, anyway, so let's see what it's got to say about old Jack. Before getting to him, though, let's take a look at a biographical sketch of a serial killer, Ted Bundy, as presented by Wikipedia. Bundy was born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. The identity of his father remains a mystery. To avoid social stigma, Bundy's grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, claimed him as their son. In taking their last name, he became Theodore Robert Cowell. Say what? He grew up believing his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was actually his older sister. He grew up believing his mother to be his older sister. Wow. Bundy biographers Stephen Mishaw and Hugh Ainsworth state that he learned Bundy biographers Stephen McCall and Hugh Ainsworth state that he learned Louise was actually his mother while he was in high school. True crime writer Ann Rule states that it was around 1969, shortly following a traumatic breakup with his college girlfriend. So we have two different accounts. Now, if we just change a few names here and there, we come up with an accurate bio of Jack Nicholson, which goes something like this. Get out of here. And see, sometimes they pull people from military families, and they also pull people from foster homes and adoption agencies as well. Orphanages. Okay, now if we just change a few names here and there, we come up with an accurate bio of Jack Nicholson, which goes something like this. Nicholson was born at some indeterminate location to an underaged, unwed showgirl. Nicholson was born at some indeterminate location, so they don't know where, to an underage, unwed showgirl. The identity of his father remains a mystery. To avoid social stigma, Nicholson's grandparents, John Joseph and Ethel Nicholson, claimed him as their son. In taking their last name, he became John Joseph Nicholson Jr. He grew up believing his mother, June Frances Nicholson, to be his older sister. Reporters state that he learned June was actually his mother in 1974 when he was 37 years old. Wow. By then, June had been dead for just over a decade, having only lived to the age of 44. It is said that Nicholson was born at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, but there is no record of such a birth, either at the hospital or in the city's archives. As it turns out, Jack Nicholson has no birth certificate. Until 1954, by which time he was nearly an adult, he did not officially exist. Even today, the closest thing he has to a birth certificate is a certificate of a delayed report of birth that was filed on May 24th, 1954. The document lists John and Ethel Nicholson as the parents and identifies the location of the birth as the Nicholson's home address in Neptune, New Jersey. That's weird in and of itself on another level. It appears then that there's no way to determine who Jack Nicholson really is. He has told journalists that he has no interest in identifying who his father was, nor, it would appear, in verifying his mother's identity. Who better to wipe clean mentally and insert spirits and beings and programming into than someone who suffers from false identity and lost identity, false sense of self and lost sense of self? That would render one a great actor. Let's continue. Quite possibly. It appears then that there is no way to determine who Jack Nicholson really is. He has told journalists that he has no interest in identifying who his father was, nor, it would appear, in verifying his mother's identity. What we do know is that the nucleus of the 1960s clique known as the Young Turks and Turkettes was composed of the following individuals: the nephew of a bonesman, the son of an OSS officer. The OSS became the CIA. The son of a naval intelligence officer. The daughter of that same naval intelligence officer. The daughter of an army intelligence officer. The daughter of a guy who openly associated with prominent gangsters throughout his life. the son of a possible psychologist, and a guy whose early years are so shrouded in mystery that he may or may not actually exist. I should probably also mention here that Henry Fonda scored his first acting gig through Dorothy Dodie Brando, the director of a local theater and the mother of Jack Nicholson's future neighbor, Marlon Brando. Being the small world that it is, Marlon's mom happened to be a good friend of Hank's mom, Elma Fonda. Truth be told, the families had likely had close ties for a long time, a very long time. The ancestors of both Marlon Brando and Henry Fonda, you see, arrived in New York at nearly the same time, roughly 3.5 centuries ago. Marlon Brando, another actor that you hear named when people say the greatest of all time. He played The Godfather. Okay. Sorry. Having a Godfather moment. Marlon Brando is in a direct line of descent from French Huguenot colonists Louis Dubois and Catherine Blanchard Dubois, and no, I'm not making that up, who arrived in New York from Mannheim, Germany, circa 1660, and promptly founded New Rochelle. So he descends from the founders of New Rochelle. Other descendants of Dubois include former U.S. Senator Leverett Saltonstall, former Massachusetts Governor and Council on Foreign Relations member William Weld, former California First Lady Maria Shriver. That's my wife. Get to the chopper now. You know, she used to be married to me before I became the governor. And then I started looking at the housekeeper. First Lady Maria Shriver, and quite likely U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter and Zachary Taylor. Wow, Brando. Your 23andMe is off the chain. Henry Fonda, on the other hand, is a direct descendant of Gilles Douw Fonda and Hester Jans Fonda, Dutch colonists who arrived in New York circa 1650 and settled near what would become Albany. The Fondas had sailed out of Friesland, Netherlands, on a ship dubbed the Valkenier, which happened to be co-owned by a very wealthy Dutchman by the name of Jean-Baptiste van Rensselaer. And Mr. van Rensselaer, as those who have been paying attention in class will recall, happened to be from the bloodline that would one day produce a guy by the name of David Van Cortlandt Crosby. So, Brando and Crosby share the same bloodline. Was that Fonda? Probably Fonda and Crosby. Fonda and Crosby. Henry Fonda and family. Well, we'll leave on that. On Golden Pond, like I say, Henry Fonda, Jane Fonda, the Fondas. I did all that dirt for this statue. You mean to tell me this is all I get? Anyway. It would appear then that Peter Fonda kind of old Crosby, that Triumph motorcycle that he gave him back in the 60s, what with David's ancestors having been cool enough to give Peter's ancestors a lift over to the New World and all. Oh, okay, right. So they weren't related. It was that the ship was co-owned by Crosby's family. Let's wrap up this chapter with a quick review of what we've learned about the people populating Laurel Canyon in the mid to late 1960s. We know that one subset of residents was a large group of musicians who all decided nearly simultaneously to flood into the canyon. The most prominent members of this group were, to an overwhelming degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community. We also know that mingled in with them were the young stars of Hollywood, who were also, to an astonishing degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community as well. And finally, we know that also in the mix were scores of military intelligence personnel who operated out of the facility known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory. I've got to say that given the relatively small size of Laurel Canyon, I'm beginning to wonder if there was any room left over for any normal folks who might have wanted to live the rock and roll lifestyle. That concludes the reading of chapter 8. 1 second while I turn off the stove and turn on the air. And perhaps we'll read one more, but we're going to have a prayer request. We're going to have a praise and prayer live stream directly after this. So please hold tight one way or the other. Maybe that's what I should do, just read a chapter a night. But I'd said I'd read 2, so just 1 second. Okay. You guys want to shoot for another chapter? We're always prayed up and covered. We can't operate in fear and do what we do. Otherwise, then it would be wise to just keep all things of the world out of your house and out of your existence. It's all bad. You can't cut on the TV. You can't walk in the grocery store. We live in the world and not of it. If these things could curse us, then the Bible would be a lie. Because there's a verse I want to give you guys real quick. If you can just bring your attention to the screen. Because this always becomes an issue when we study things outside of the Word, which sometimes we have to do to learn things in the world. There's a scripture that you need. I want to thank Sister T for pointing this scripture out to me, and I give all thanks to the Lord for bringing it to my attention many times since then. Can you see it? Can you see it? Can you see it? Oh, that's just a scripture, brother. That doesn't mean anything. Dr. Strange is going to jump to the screen and possess your dreams. I want to talk a little bit about that too. I'll save that for the next live stream. I'll save that for the next. Not that I want to talk about Dr. Strange, but I want to talk about the power that we have versus the power that evil has over us. Evil's power requires our permission. It requires our ignorance and our permission. Our people perish or are destroyed for lack of knowledge. We give permission and legal right to certain things simply by letting them in our lives. Absolutely true. So again, for some folks, this is not your battlefield. So stay off this field. But if this is your battlefield, you're built for this, then you understand that the curse causeless shall not come. We always walk in the full, whole armor of God. We don't operate in fear of anything but him. And he will sometimes reveal to us dark things. Remember what he showed to Ezekiel through the wall? That was dark and scary stuff, but he had to show how things were being manipulated behind the scenes. And that's why we do readings like these. So just remember that the curse causeless shall not come. We're not going to get something that we don't deserve. God is not some sort of automatic system. He's a loving person, a being that knows you and loves you and understands your every intention. You can't fool him. So he knows what you're doing and why you're really doing it. Amen. So again, what do y'all, would you like to, let me see what people said about one more chapter or not, because we can go ahead and go to prayer. You want to read one more chapter or no? But y'all put that in your arsenal. Put that in your arsenal, because you need that out here. You need that. Give God his word. Thank you, Jira R. Give God his word. And let me tell y'all something. No, I'm not finna wait until the next live stream. I'm finna say it now. I'm finna say it now, and I dare you to stop me. Hold on. And this is for no particular person. This ain't for no particular person. This ain't for no particular person. This ain't for no particular person. But it's for anybody who need it. If the shoe fit, stick out your foot and let me lace you up one time. As a man thinketh, so shall he be. And the curse causeless shall not come. Oh, the devil is, they're doing this to me, they're doing that to me. Can you pray in the name of Jesus? First of all, some of you do not pray. You still won't pray in the name of Jesus, and you're not fooling me. You're not going to wear me out. If you don't want to pray in the name of Jesus, that's on you. But it ain't nothing I can do for you. And deliverance ministers who call other names are in short supply and don't have a very good track record. We have decades of history behind deliverance ministry that shows and proves when worldly wasn't for no games. You have power. There's power of life and death in the tongue. Bridle your tongue. Some people always mind his mouth, and you invite curses to come then. You're giving them permission. Can't nobody boss you around and do whatever they want to do to you. I thought you were the head and not the tail. I thought that you were fearfully and wonderfully made. I thought that you was blessed going in and coming out. I thought that you were blessed and highly favored. Do you not put on the Ephesians 6 whole armor of God every day? Do you operate in the joy of the Lord, or do you operate in the fear of the world? Do you operate in the joy of the Lord, or do you operate in the fear of the world every day? Do you have the joy of the Lord? Last time we talked about the comfort of the comforter. A lot of folks need that comfort, the comfort of the comforter, which is the Holy Spirit. These things will give you peace of mind. He is in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on the Lord. You're always worried about what somebody can do to you. That's why they can do something to you. Like Monolans people say, you can't do me none. You try to do me that? As a man thinketh, so shall he be. and test the spirit by the spirit. You want to fight fire with fire, everything gonna burn up. Somebody coming at you with witchcraft, you come at them with Jesus. Unless you do that, you're gonna have a long fight. A tight fight that you might not win in the end. But let's read a little bit more. One more. Some people don't have no joy. They're not operating in the comfort of the Comforter, and they don't have no joy of the Lord, so they can't operate in power. But y'all come back for next hour. Let's go through this chapter 9. Chapter 9. And then immediately after this, prayer and praise and fire and brimstone too. Whatever the Lord say to do. Lord, guide my tongue, my mind, and my heart to only say what you want me to. Weird scenes inside the canyon. There were a lot of weird people around. Well, that's an understatement. Quote, there were a lot of weird people around. There was one guy who had a parrot called Captain Blood, and he was always scrawling real cryptic things on the inside walls of my house. Neil Young's house, too. Quote, unquote. That's from Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell never lied. Yes, she did, Q-Tip. That's from Joni Mitchell describing the Laurel Canyon scene toward the end of the 1960s. As it turns out, Laurel Canyon was large enough to accommodate at least a few more strange characters. Two of them were guys named Jerry Brown and Mike Curb. Actually, it's unclear whether Curb ever lived there, but he was very much a part of the scene in the 1960s and 1970s. Edmund G. Jerry Brown Jr. had a decidedly conservative upbringing. Born into a politically well-connected Republican family, Jerry devoted his early years to pursuing a career in the Jesuit priesthood. His father, a very active Republican Party operative, was an aspiring politician who initially had no luck in getting himself elected to public office. He ultimately succeeded, though, in capturing the coveted California governor's seat in 1959, and he did it by employing a simple gimmick. He changed the R after his name to a D and was reborn as a Democrat. He held the seats for 2 terms, though, through to 1967, and then was replaced by a guy who had employed the exact same trick in reverse. He had replaced the D after his name with an R. That gentleman, of course, was Ronald Wilson Reagan. And he would govern the state through 1975, after which he handed the reins back over to the Brown family, this time to the younger Edmund Brown, who, like his dad, had decided that he was a liberal Democrat. In fact, according to the consensus opinion of the media at the time, Jerry was an ultra-liberal extremist whose politics fell somewhere to the left of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. During Laurel Canyon's glory years, Jerry Brown resided in a home on Wonderland Avenue, within easy walking distance of the Wonderland Death House and the homes of numerous singers, songwriters, and musicians. His circle of friends in those days was widely reported, included the elite of Laurel Canyon's country rock stars, including Linda Ronstadt, with whom he was long rumored to be romantically involved. Also including his circle of friends included Jackson Browne and the Eagles. Another figure making the rounds in Laurel Canyon during the same period of time was Mike Curb. At various times, Curb worked as a musician, composer, recording artist, film producer, and record company executive. He also had the notable distinction of serving as the musical director on the notorious documentary featuring Mondo Hollywood, which ostensibly chronicled the emerging Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene. Filmed from 1965 through 1967, the film featured representatives from the Manson family, Bobby Beausoleil, the Manson family's victims, Jay Sebring, the Freak Troupe, Vito, Carl, Sue, and Godot, and Laurel Canyon's musical fraternity, Frank Zappa, along with his future wife, Gail Slotman. It also featured acid guru Richard Alpert, Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown, and Princess Margaret, a good friend to John Phillips and a rumored lover of Mick Jagger. Mondo Hollywood. So Mondo Hollywood would be required watching for someone really wanting to dive deeper into this. That someone isn't me, but it may be you. Thank you, gifted hands, and God bless you. Let's look here at Mondo Hollywood. Mondo is in world. Mondo, right? Or no. 1967 film. A documentary Mondo movie by Robert Carl Cohen, released in 1967. It's a two-hour long documentary, and wow, it's not on YouTube. It's not on YouTube. Interesting. The harder something is to find, the more I want to watch it. So perhaps I'll have to watch this one after watching a few episodes of Forensic Files, where I've learned to do this vocal inflection. It's adding another dimension to my reading, at least of this book. As noted, Mondo Hollywood was the creation of filmmaker Robert Carl Cohen. It turns out he, too, had an interesting background for a guy destined to capture on film the emerging 1960s countercultural scene. In 1954, Cohen served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. The following year, he was on assignment to NATO. Following that, he served in special services in Germany. The very next year, he produced, directed, edited, and narrated a documentary short entitled Inside Red China. 2 years later, he wore all the same hats for a documentary entitled Inside East Germany. Interesting places he's going inside. From the intelligence community perspective, at least. A few years later, he put together another documentary entitled Three Cubans, a decidedly unsympathetic take on the Cuban Revolution. Cohen has proudly proclaimed that he was the first, or at least among the first, of the Western journalists and filmmakers allowed to enter and shoot footage in each one of those ostensibly communist countries. In the case of Cuba, and likely in the case of the others as well on the low, he did so under the direct sponsorship of the U.S. State Department. Mr. Cohen would like us to believe that he undertook those projects as nothing more than what he outwardly appeared to be, an independent filmmaker. But a great deal of naivete is required to believe that a private citizen not working for the intelligence community could land such assignments. The Los Angeles Times, in a lengthy critique of Cohen's counterculture film published on October 1st, 1969, offered up some curious and long-forgotten facts about the documentary feature. Quote, I cannot presume to guess how much real life pokes through Mondo Hollywood. In violent, sudden ways, real death did intrude during the 18 months of picture making. Wow. 3 people were killed in automobile crashes. One of them was Jane Mansfield. I heard she was beheaded, whose brief appearance, in the crash, which would go along with Satan's fulfillment of his promises. Pardon me. So, okay, pardon me. Okay, all right. Okay, so This is from the Los Angeles Times, offering up some curious and long-forgotten facts about Mondo Hollywood. Quote, I cannot presume to guess how much real life pokes through Mondo Hollywood. In violent, sudden ways, real death did intrude during the 18 months of picture making. 3 people were killed in automobile crashes. One of them was Jane Mansfield, whose brief appearance as a celebrity in a montage of premieres remains in the final movie. The other 2, including a bona fide philosopher, were scheduled to appear but died before filming. A writer, who was to play himself, died of drugs. A 3-year-old child died of a fall through a trap door, although he and his parents are still in the picture. A pilot who had agreed to fly in the film died of a mid-air crash. In all, 6 people, none of them old, none of them in bed, 6 people died before Mondo Hollywood was released. Several buildings were also destroyed in this impermanent place. And the Goodyear blimp, which provided the platform for some spectacular aerials in the finished movie, the Goodyear blimp crashed one day after its chores were done on behalf of the movie. It appears then that just as in the real Laurel Canyon, Cohen's celluloid version masked a backdrop of violence, destruction, and death, the same spirits that were in the people that the film was about would naturally be in the film. That's my sidebar. As for Mike Curb, in addition to his work on Mondo Hollywood, he also served as song producer on another key countercultural film of the era, Riot on the Sunset Strip, which, despite its title, had little to do with the actual event. In addition, Curb scored a slew of cheaply produced biker flicks, including The Wild Angels, Devil's Angels, Born Losers, The Savage Seven, and The Glory Stompers. Along the way, he worked alongside many of Laurel Canyon's young Turks, including Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper. It is unclear whether the paths of Jerry Brown and Mike Curb crossed during Laurel Canyon's glory years, but as fate would have it, they were to cross in 1979 in Sacramento, California. Mike Curb, as it turns out, after being encouraged by Ronald Reagan to venture into politics, Mike Curb was elected to serve as Governor Jerry Brown's second in command. And so it was that these 2 men, both veterans of the 1960s Laurel Canyon scene, a counterculture, anti-government scene, right? Both of these veterans came to sit side by side in the governor's mansion, one sporting a D after his name and the other an R. What a coincidence. What a coincidence. The very movement that as a youth you appeared to be so dead set against. That's out of the realm of happenstance. Yes, many of the things that we thought when we were young and impressionable, we come to know better than those things. And we may appear to be the opposite in a lot of ways than we once were. I understand that. But this is a philosophical, almost a spiritual change from one who wants to be a soldier in the fight against the system to becoming one of the players in the system. Governor Brown, however, had little time to spend on actually governing the state of California. Tossing his hat into the presidential ring, he spent much of his time out of the state, working the campaign trail. That allowed Lieutenant Governor Curb, as acting governor of the state, to sign into law a withering array of reactionary legislation that was very far removed from what the people of California thought they were getting when they elected Governor Moonbeam, quote unquote. This arrangement allowed the nominal liberal of the Laurel Canyon tag team, Jerry Brown, to keep his hands clean, even as his administration moved far away from its originally stated goals, and even as he made little effort to rein in his underling. Brown and Curb weren't the only up-and-coming politicos who managed to find living space in Laurel Canyon back in the day. In July 2008, the venerable Washington Post revealed that a former reporter and novelist by the name of Alex Abela had, quote, written a history of Rand, R-A-N-D, which was founded more than 60 years ago by the Air Force as a font on ideas on how that service might fight and win a nuclear war with the USSR. Abela focuses on Albert Wohlstetler, a mathematical logician turned nuclear strategist who was the dominant figure at Rand starting in the early 1950s, and whose influence has extended beyond his death into 1997 into the current Bush administration. Wohlstetler epitomized what became known as the Rand approach, a relentlessly reductive, determinately quantitative analysis of whatever problem the independent, nonprofit think tank was assigned, whether it be the design of a new bomber or, unfortunately, improving public education at inner city schools, because that Rand approach doesn't work for those two extremes in the same way. The Rand Corporation is a lot of things, but independent has never been one of them. Also, in the Post's book review, we find that it was not so much Wohlstetler himself as his acolytes, who had a major impact in Washington. Most of those acolytes need little introduction. Why, you've got former Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl, who once dated Wohlstetler's daughter, former U.S. Ambassador, President of the World Bank, and Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, the Wolfster, the Wolfman, former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the UN, Zalmay Khalilzad, and Andrew Marshall, who has served as the Director of the United States Department of Defense's Office of Net Assessment for 40 years, and who served as a mentor to Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. Names made famous during the 9/11 is a joke campaign. In the latter half of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, while Wohlstetler was with the Rand Corporation and also serving as a professor at UCLA, and while his wife Roberta also worked as an analyst for Rand, Albert and his followers, the men who would serve as the architects of U.S. foreign policy during the George W. Bush administration, regularly met in a heavily wooded neighborhood in Los Angeles known as Laurel Canyon. As Greg Herkin wrote in his review of Abela's book, those bright, eager, and ambitious young men had sat cross-legged on the floor with their mentor at his stylish home in Laurel Canyon. Just as not far away, Vito's early young followers sat cross-legged with their mentor, or Vito and the Freaks. And just as not far away, Charles Manson's eager young followers would sit cross-legged on the floor with their mentor. Some spirit that has dominion over that area is big on setting up a cult atmosphere, some religious spirit, to say the least. Paul Young, writing in LA Exposed, revealed that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was another curious group calling Laurel Canyon home. The most infamous male madam throughout LA's sordid history would have to be Billy Breyers. Billy Breyers, the wealthy son of an oil magnate and part-time producer of gay porn. Breyers was said to have a stellar group of customers, using his brothel at the summit of Laurel Canyon. Of course he did. In fact, some have claimed that none other than J. Edgar Hoover, the founder and chief executive officer of the FBI, was one of Breyers' best clients. When Breyers fell under police scrutiny in 1973, allegedly for trafficking in child pornography, officers obtained a number of confessions from some of his hustlers, and some of them identified Hoover and Clyde Tolson as Mother John and Uncle Mike, and claimed that they had serviced them on numerous occasions. Mother John, I'm sure, for Hoover, because he liked to wear ladies' clothes. It appears that the top law enforcement officials in the nation were also a part of the Laurel Canyon scene, along with various other unnamed persons of prominence, or at least that's what they say. And in the intelligence community, throwing that type of slander and or libel around, if it's in print, is commonplace. It's a good way to, despite what the pink hand agenda is attempting to do and will do, it is still a knee-jerk reaction within people to see you unfavorably as a man if you do certain things that compromise your manhood. Okay, anyway. It appears then that the top law enforcement officials in the nation were also a part of the Laurel Canyon scene, along with various other unnamed persons of prominence. And we also find, perhaps not too shockingly at this point, that Laurel Canyon was a portal of child pornography. In January of 2011, the San Francisco Chronicle reported on the passing of Ron Patterson, the flamboyant, free-spirited creator of the Renaissance and Dickens fairs, who had died January 15th at a friend's house in Sausalito after an illness. He was 80. As staff writer Carolyn Jones noted in the article, Patterson's creation was sort of a medieval precursor to Burning Man. And Burning Man is, of course, a rather explicitly occult ritual first performed on the summer solstice of 1986 and now performed every summer in Nevada's Black Rock Desert before an audience of over 50,000 people. In the beginning, the Renaissance Fair was an experiment in Mr. Patterson's backyard. In the early 1960s, Mr. Patterson and his wife Phyllis, who were both interested in theater and art, began hosting children's improvisational theater workshops at their Laurel Canyon home. One naturally wonders whether aspiring thespian and golden child Godo Pelikis, originally cast, it will be recalled, to play the lead in Kenneth Anger's Lucifer Rising. One naturally would wonder whether that little boy was involved in those workshops. In any event, there is something decidedly creepy about children's workshops being hosted in a small, tight-knit community that was home to a child porn ring and more than its fair share of pedos. Yet another curious character to take up residence in Laurel Canyon was producer Paul Rothschild. who played a key role in shaping the sound of both the Doors and the group Love. In June 1981, Sports Illustrated publisher Philip Howlett penned a short piece to introduce readers to new writer Bjorn Rostang. Born in Lincoln, New York, Rostang grew up in various places in Connecticut where he attended what he recalls as an even dozen schools. I got my BA and master's in English from the University of Connecticut, he says. Then I did part of a PhD at the University of Washington before going into the Army Intelligence Corps in 1959. We had Paul Rothschild, who later became producer for The Doors, and Janis Joplin, to give you some idea of what the unit was like. Unquote. It was, in all likelihood, like countless other intelligence units designed to churn out shapers of public opinion, whether they be actors, novelists, newsmen, or in this case, sports writers and producers of popular music. It is quite shocking, of course, to learn that the handler of two of Laurel Canyon's most influential and groundbreaking bands had a background in intelligence work. Apparently, the search is still on for anyone of any prominence in the Laurel Canyon scene who didn't have direct connections to the intelligence community. Pardon me, I'm so sorry. Bjorn Rostang would perhaps not surprisingly develop his own indirect connections to the Laurel Canyon music scene. His most notable contribution to the field of literature was penning the mass-market paperback version of Phantom of the Paradise, the campy tale of a Phil Spector-inspired music producer who had sold his soul to the devil for fame and fortune, and who subsequently manipulated a disfigured young singer-songwriter into likewise selling his soul. Interesting book, Phantom of the Paradise. The theatrical version, released on Halloween Day 1974 and carrying the tagline, "He sold his soul for rock and roll," really, starred Laurel Canyon's own Paul Williams as Swan, the demonic producer who surrounds himself with nubile young women eager to do his bidding. Muses is what he'll call them in the studio. Williams, who lived on Lookout Mountain alongside numerous other singer-songwriters, also scored the film. He made the music. It is, I'm sure, entirely coincidental that two guys who emerged from the same intelligence unit in the early 1960s would follow such curious career paths. One, Paul Rothschild, becoming what many on the scene in those days would have described as a demonic rock music producer, and the other, Bjorn Rostang, who wrote a novel about a demonic rock music producer. There was one other person, while he never took up residence in Laurel Canyon, who had a profound influence on the scene. That guy was Augustus Owsley Stanley III. Sound like he would be the next villain in a Batman movie. The premier LSD chemist of the hippie era. No one, not Ken Kesey, not Richard Alpert, not even Timothy Leary, no one did more to, quote, turn on the youth of the 1960s to dope than Owsley. Leary and his cohorts may have captured the national media spotlight and created public awareness, but it was Owsley who flooded the streets of San Francisco and Laurel Canyon with consistently high-quality, inexpensive, readily available acid. By most accounts, he was never in it for the money. He routinely gave away more of his product than he sold. What then was his motive? According to Martin Lee and Bruce Schlein, writing in Acid Dreams, Owsley cultivated an image as a wizard alchemist whose intentions with LSD were priestly and magical. Owsley is revered by many as something of an icon of the 1960s counterculture, a man motivated by nothing more than an altruistic desire to turn on the world, man. But his rather provocative background and family history suggest that his intentions may not have necessarily been so altruistic. Augustus Owsley Stanley III was the son, naturally enough, of Augustus Owsley Stanley II, who served as a military officer during World War II aboard the USS Lexington and therefore found work in Washington, D.C. as a government attorney. He raised his son primarily in Arlington, Virginia. Young Owsley's grandfather was Augustus Owsley Stanley, who served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1903 through 1915, as the governor of Kentucky from 1915 through 1919, and as a U.S. Senator from 1919 through 1925. Senator Stanley's father, a minister with the Disciples of Christ, served as a judge advocate with the Confederate Army. Owsley's mother was a niece of William Owsley, who also served as a governor of Kentucky from 1844 through 1848, and who lent his name to Owsley County, Kentucky. During Owsley III's formative years, he attended the prestigious Charlotte Hall Military Academy in Maryland, but was reportedly tossed out in the 9th grade for being intoxicated. Not long after that, at the tender age of 15, Owsley voluntarily committed himself to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. St. Elizabeth's, it should be noted, had a far more sinister name upon its founding in 1855. It was called the Governmental Hospital for the Insane. The Government Hospital for the Insane. He remained confined there for treatment for the next 15 months. During that time, his mother, in keeping with one of the recurrent themes of this saga, passed away. Owsley apparently resumed his education following his curious confinement, but he had reportedly dropped out of school by the age of 18. Nevertheless, he apparently had no trouble at all gaining acceptance to the University of Virginia, which he attended for a time before enlisting in the U.S. Air Force in 1956 at the age of 21. During his military service, Owsley was an electronics specialist, working in radio intelligence and radar. After his stint in the Air Force, Owsley set up camp in the Los Angeles area ostensibly to study ballet. During that same time, he worked at Pasadena's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was undoubtedly the primary reason for his move to LA in 1963. Owsley moved once again, this time to Berkeley, California, which just happened to be ground zero of the budding anti-war movement. He may or may not have briefly attended UC Berkeley, which is where he allegedly cribbed the recipe for LSD from the university library. Owsley soon began cooking up both methadone and LSD in a makeshift bathroom lab near the campus of the university. On February 21st, 1965, boy, what a date. That would be like the ultimate dream, astrologically. So this is probably some kind of setup. On February 21st, 1965, that lab was raided by state narcotics agents who seized all his lab equipment and charged Stanley with operating a meth lab. As Barry Miles recounted in Hippie, Berkeley was awash with speed, and Owsley was responsible for much of it. You know, they do certain things on certain dates because there's witches and warlocks in control at the top of these organizations, even the police, and they know that there are certain days where it's supposed to be more advantageous to do one thing versus another, according to their belief as astrotheists and Luciferians. Our God can do anything but fail on any given day. He's not bound by the laws of the universe or the cosmos. He made those. Nevertheless, Owsley walked away from the raid unscathed, and with the help of his attorney, who happened to be the vice mayor of Berkeley, he even successfully sued to have all his lab equipment returned. Wow. He quickly put that equipment to work producing some 4 million tabs of nearly pure LSD in the mid-1960s. Immediately after the raid of February 1965, Owsley and his frequent sidekicks, the Grateful Dead, yes, Owsley and his frequent sidekicks, the Grateful Dead, moved down to the Watts area of Los Angeles, of all places. In other words, they went to the black part, not just the poor part, but the poor black part. Moved down to the Watts area of Los Angeles. This is where Fred and Lamont live. Okay? And Esther and Grady and Rollo and all the rest of them. Can't forget them. Moved down to the Watts area of Los Angeles, of all places, to ostensibly conduct acid tests. Oh, of course. The group rented a house that was conveniently located right next door to a brothel, curiously paralleling the modus operandi of various intelligence operatives who were or had been involved in conducting their own acid tests. So the CIA would do the same thing. In another country, on a foreign soil, they would move next to a brothel, or when dealing with some enemy state or nation, they would set up shop next to a brothel. When it came time to bug certain individuals, they would often use the prostitutes to aid them in that, and use the cover of prostitution or the brothel itself. Pardon me. Okay. The band departed the communal dwelling in April 1965, the Grateful Dead. It was a fortuitous departure, as it turned out, since just a few months later, Watts exploded in violence that left 34 corpses littered in the streets. So as soon as the Grateful Dead left after experimenting and doing some tests in that area. Interesting. Watts riots. Okay. It's coinkydink. It was a fortuitous departure, as it turned out, since just a few months later, Watts exploded in violence that left 34 corpses littering the streets. Owsley had been with the Dead from the band's earliest days, as both a financial backer and as their sound engineer. He is credited with numerous electronic innovations that changed the way live rock music was presented to the masses, and likely not in a good way, given that his work as a sound technician undoubtedly drew heavily upon his military training. And we can add to that his understanding of intelligence techniques. They used sound weaponry, sonar, and other types. In 1965, Owsley unleashed on the hate a particularly nasty hallucinogen known as STP. Developed by the friendly folks at Dow Chemical, STP had been tested extensively at Frank Zappa's former home, the Edgewood Arsenal, as a possible biowarfare agent before being distributed to hippies as a recreational drug. Owsley reportedly obtained the recipe from Alexander Shulgin, a former Harvard man who developed a keen interest in psychopharmacology while serving in the U.S. Navy. Shulgin worked for many years as a senior research chemist at Dow and later worked very closely with the DEA. In 1970, Owsley began serving time after a conviction on drug charges. That time was served, appropriately enough, at Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution, the very same prison that had just a few years earlier housed both Charlie Manson and Flying Burrito Brothers road manager Phil Kaufman. A few years later, it would also be home to both Timothy Leary and his alleged nemesis, G. Gordon Liddy. After his release, Owsley continued to work as a sound technician, eventually graduating to a new medium, television. Owsley eventually moved to Australia in the 1980s, becoming a naturalized citizen in 1996. On March 12, 2012, the aging chemist was reportedly killed in an automobile accident near his Queensland home when his car veered off the road in a storm and plowed into some trees. And that concludes our read of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. For this time, let's grab a couple of comments. We'll come back and read chapter 10 before the end of this weekend. So we'll say Sunday night. If not tomorrow night. So join us either tomorrow night or Sunday night for Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, chapter 10. And we're going to try to get at least 3 chapters in. And if you would like to, please do join us. If you would like to. You don't have to. But we'd like you to if you want to. Come back and join us in about 10 or 15 minutes tops. For prayer and praise and worship. Okay? Thank you so much for being here tonight and for listening. We thank you for your time. We thank you so much for your generosity and contribution. All of those who super chatted, thank you so much for that. And I thank you all. You could be anywhere in the world and you decided to be here tonight. So I thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this reading. I know a lot of folks have commented that they went and got the book. I mean, this book is just, it's slap after slap after slap, isn't it? He just keeps on hitting you with rough stuff. But it just goes to show how things are connected in the workings of this world behind closed doors. And that's why we're reading it. Books like these, and sometimes others, like sometimes autobiographies, can help us to see, or at least get a glimpse into a world that is very secretive and that people are afraid to even speak of most of the time, let alone even admit it exists. Amen. So, all right, y'all come back in about 10 or 15 if you want to join us for more, which will be prayer and praise, worship, and we will read more of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon either tomorrow night or Sunday night. Okay? Thank you all. Love y'all.